One of the important things to look at when we talk about gender-based violence is the nature of structural transformation that is taking place in India today, which is intimately tied up with the whole neoliberal transformation. Within the question of neoliberal transformation, the state has taken over particular role and the market is playing an important role, and within which women are conceptualized as important contributor to the economy. And this conceptualization of women as contributor to Indian economy borders around the issues of how women are placed at home. So there is a kind of intimate tie-up between the private space and public space in terms of how women have to uh, equally divide their labor, responsibilities, and practices of affection towards both the private and public sphere. So this creates some tensions because the fact that women are in the public space to make particular contribution to the state through their own labor participation meant that they have to considerably divide their time. But this is not taken into account when they are counting the GDP of the country. The GDP is counted without taking into account what women make as contribution, primarily because the insertion of all young women, particularly in the informal sector economy. So this has created a new forms of violences both within the family and in the public sphere. Taking note of this changing nature of economy and the social transformation, reflecting upon women's contribution and the manner in which economic transformation inserts women primarily as labor has made particular kind of impact in women's life and existence and mobility as well. Mobility has another factor, which is the way in which caste itself has transformed, accommodating this new economic transformation. Women's role within the caste society and within the family, which is definitely bounded by caste hierarchies, have a particular role in terms of how it inflicts violence on women. So, therefore, I think what is significant to note in this context of connectivity is the nature of young women's mobility is not merely as women as one group, a block, which sort of makes a kind of uh, transformation in terms of their work. Here is the important factor to take into account is the caste based mobility, particularly for the backward caste and backward caste families, where young women at a time when they are able to access education, particularly Dalit women and OBC women, they access education today. And there is a possibility because state welfare policies do target young women to access education and employment. However, their mobility is caste bound. They are constantly surveilled through the caste system and by the caste families. So, therefore, what happens is the mobility is a restricted forms of mobility, which is only about performing the labor in the public sphere and do not entertain any other forms of mobility or desire to be displayed in the public sphere. So, this restrictive mobility means forms of violence also has changed to an extent that surveillance can be a ubiquitous form of perpetuation of violence against young girl. This is very distinct way in which mobility is regulated through this transformation of economy. I think these are important factors to keep in mind when we talk about gender violence. Is the notion of freedom and equality, which has not been sufficiently critically looked at as much as feminist movement has been looking at critically looking at the violence, forms of violence, and theorizing violence. How do we really then conceptualize freedom, which will enable us to overcome varied forms of violence? In order to do so, I think we need to take into account what is the conceptualization of freedom that is given to us from the movement perspective and from the state perspective. The state and the neoliberal discourse about freedom is very, very clear that it will not accommodate feminist desire for freedom across spaces. That is, One of the important aspect of feminist contention about freedom today is not about absolute choices, which they are not able to make. It is about the manner in which women's contribution and the values of labor is recognized, and therefore, based on that recognition, redistribution of resources take place so that women can have actual substantial equality, and that substantial equality is not there, and therefore the freedom is also embedded not in terms of collective practices of freedom by women, but it has been fragmented by the state with the idea of individual freedom. So the individual freedom is very intimately connected to market ideas of freedom, where it is very clear that as long as women access freedom through notions of enterprising roles and entrepreneurial kind of contribution they make, they can also enjoy certain freedoms of bringing out their individuality. But that is not the freedom that the feminists are talking about. So, the freedom and equality and retheorization by feminists need to be foregrounded to understand how we can encounter violence. So, therefore, I think these are intimately connected. And in order to do so, I think critical engagement today need to be the critique of the notion of freedom that the state is profoundly bringing through welfare politics, and figuring the state as something that is extremely in various forms, even in a welfare state, it is a masculine state. How exactly this the figure of the state as masculinity controls and regulates the mobility and spaces of women uh, across caste and class is important, but it's also how intersectionally they embed themselves in varied experiences of gender relations. So these are something that I can say. But to put it concretely, how exactly we can move, with these strategies to counter gender violence, I think one of the important aspect is to re-theorize not just freedom, re-theorize the notion of gender and the notion of masculinity and femininity. And by far, I think Indian feminist groups have little, conversations about masculinity itself, the problem of masculinity, and the notions of diverse experience of men in performing masculinity. Those are very, very contextual. I think we need to talk about historical, structural, contextual transformations. That is important to understand gender violence.